Sawyer's father had been explaining brazing to me for the better part of 20 minutes when I finally set down my wineglass and said, as quietly as I say most things, that I happened to run the kitchen he built. The fork in his hand didn't drop, but it stopped halfway to his mouth, the way a clock stops when you finally notice it ticking. The braised short rib he'd been holding up as evidence of how few young cooks understand patience hung there in the air between us, and for the first time all evening, nobody at that table said a word. To make sense of how we got there, I have to go back about 3 weeks, to a Tuesday night when Sawyer came home with 2 bags of groceries and the particular silence of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation the whole drive home. I'd worked a double. My whites were balled up in my bag, and I was sitting at our kitchen counter in an old culinary school t-shirt, eating cold leftover farro straight out of the container because I was too tired to plate it like a person. I had been executive chef at the Hartfield for exactly 23 days. I still hadn't told my own mother in a way that felt real. I kept saying it out loud in the walk-in when nobody was around, just to hear how it sounded. Executive chef, mine. The whole pass, the whole brigade, the menu, the name on the door I'd grown up reading about in magazines. Sawyer put the bags down and didn't unpack them, which is how I knew something, he said. This Sunday. At the house. Okay. I scraped the last of the farro. Sure, there's a thing though. I put the fork down. In my experience, that sentence has never once arrived by itself. He pulled a cutting board off the rack, set it on the counter, picked up an onion, and then just held it like he needed his hands occupied to get the rest out. My dad doesn't really know what you do. He knows I cook. He knows you're a chef. Sawyer set the onion down. He doesn't know where. Or what your title is. I waited. He thinks you're still somewhere. That's kind of what I let him believe. What does he think I am, exactly? Sawyer had the decency to look me in the eye when he said it. A line cook, working your way up at a place downtown. I sat with that. Sawyer, I run the Hartfield. I know, I run his Hartfield. The restaurant his entire life is wrapped up in. I know. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. Every time it almost came up, it turned into this whole landmine. I wanted him to meet you first, as a person, not as a headline he could have opinions about before you even walked in the door. I understood it more than I wanted to. My whole adult life, I'd walked into rooms as a resume. CIA, then 4 years on the line in 2 different cities, then sous, then chef de cuisine, then the pass at a 1-star, and now this. The title always arrived a half-second before I did. There was something almost luxurious in the idea of being introduced as nobody, as just the woman Sawyer was seeing. But, tell me about your father, I said. Sawyer finally started chopping, slow and unmeasured, the way someone does when the chopping is just a way of not making eye contact. His father, he told me, had opened the Hartfield 31 years ago, back when that block was nothing but a parking lot and a shuttered hardware store. He'd built it knuckle by knuckle. He'd made it the kind of place where people proposed and celebrated their last good anniversaries and drove 2 hours for a reservation. He'd run that kitchen for almost 3 decades, and then 4 years ago he hadn't. The ownership group had brought in investors. There'd been a renovation, a rebrand, talk of evolving the concept, all the soft language people use when they mean someone older is in the way. He was 61. He'd been told very gently, with very good severance, that the restaurant was going in a direction that called for a different kind of energy. He still had a plaque on the wall by the host stand. He had never once gone back to eat. He doesn't talk about it, Sawyer said, but it's the whole shape of him now. He thinks food got worse after he left. Not just there, everywhere. He thinks the whole industry went soft, technically skilled, he'll say, but no spine. And women, I asked, because I always ask. Sawyer winced. He's not cruel about it. He came up in kitchens where the toughest guy yelling won. He's got this idea that running a kitchen is mostly about who can take the heat the longest, and he's never quite been convinced women want it badly enough. He'd never say it like that to your face. He'd just imply it. For an hour. I'd heard some version of that opinion maybe 400 times, from men who quizzed me about my knife collection like a security checkpoint. from a chef who once handed me a saucier station and then narrated loudly to the whole line that he was curious to see how she handles a real Saturday. It was practically a piece of furniture in my life by now. I'd stopped tripping over it years ago. Does he know who's running the Hartfield now? I asked. Sawyer shook his head. He won't even read the reviews. Mom showed him one once and he left the table. He just knows they brought in someone new last year and he assumes it's some guy with a podcast. He almost laughed and then didn't. He said he hoped they finally found somebody who'd take it seriously, his words. I turned that over for a second. Outside, the L rattled by 2 blocks over and faded. Somebody's car alarm chirped twice in the lot and went quiet. Okay, I said. I'll come to dinner. I'll come as your girlfriend. No title. He blinked. You'd do that? Your dad wants to meet a person. I can be a person for one Sunday. I picked the fork back up, but I'm not going to lie if he asks me a direct question. I'm not going to sit there and call myself a line cook. I'd never ask you to. He exhaled like he'd been holding it since the parking lot. He probably won't even get into work that much. I gave him a look. Neither of us believed that for a second. His parents lived out past the western suburbs in one of those old streets where the houses were brick and a little too big, and the trees had clearly been there longer than anyone currently paying the mortgage. We drove out on a gray Sunday in November, the kind of flat Midwestern sky that makes the whole world feel like it's holding still. Sawyer was quiet for most of the highway. He's going to ask you questions, he said somewhere around the exit ramp. A lot of them. Don't take it personal. Chefs interrogate. I know the dialect. You're really not nervous. I thought about my first month at the Hartfield, walking the line at 4 in the afternoon, with 22 people watching to see whether the new chef, the woman they'd been warned about, would flinch. I've run a Saturday night with a broken walk-in and a Sue out with the flu, I said. I think I can survive a roast. He smiled, and his shoulders came down off his ears a little. Their house was a brick 2-story with black shutters and a front garden that had clearly been somebody's whole personality for years. Even in November, you could see the bones of it. Staked tomato cages put away for winter, a row of rosemary in clay pots by the porch that someone had hauled close to the brick to keep them warm. 3 of them carefully tended. I noticed because that kind of detail tells you something. People who keep rosemary alive through a Chicago winter are people who don't quit on things. The front door opened before we hit the steps. Sawyer's father was both exactly what I'd pictured and not at all. He was big through the shoulders, white hair cropped close, with the upright, planted way of standing that men who've spent 30 years not sitting down develop in their spine. He had the eyes of someone who reads a room in 2 seconds and rarely revises. I knew that look. You either grow into it behind a pass or you don't, and he had grown into it all the way to the bone. Sawyer, he said, gripping his son's shoulder. Then he turned to me and something in him performed a quick automatic assessment, the kind you can't switch off after enough years. And you're the one we've been hearing about. I am, I said. It's good to finally meet you. His handshake was firm without making a show of it. Behind him, Sawyer's mother appeared, smaller than I'd expected, with quick, warm eyes and the unhurried calm of a woman who has spent decades being the steady one in a house full of big personalities. She took both my hands for a second and said they'd been looking forward to this, and I believed her completely. The house smelled like a Sunday. Onions going slow somewhere, thyme, the deep brown smell of meat that had been in the oven since church. The hallway walls were a museum of their life. Vacations, graduations, and tucked in among them, the ones I couldn't help but stop at. Him, 20 years younger in chef whites behind a stainless pass. A line of cooks outside a back door, arms crossed, that wide, confident grin. And one I recognized before I could stop my face from doing anything. The old Hartfield dining room before the renovation, the original brass sconces still on the walls. He caught me looking. The Hartfield, he said. 31 years. I know the room, I said, just that. He nodded once, like that was the correct amount of reverence. Sawyer says you cook. I do. Downtown, I said, which was true and useless, and he accepted it the way you accept an answer from someone you've already decided isn't worth a follow-up. His mother steered us toward the dining room before the conversation could go anywhere, the gentle traffic control of a woman who's broken up 1,000 kitchen arguments at this table. It was set beautifully. Real cloth napkins, a little dish of marinated olives, bread still warm enough to fog the butter. Somebody had spent the afternoon on this. Dinner started easy. His mother asked about our drive, about a trip Sawyer and I had taken to Savannah in the spring, about the apartment. His father ate methodically, the way line cooks eat even 30 years later, fast, efficient, no ceremony, and mostly listened, dropping in the occasional precise question. He was civil, genuinely. Whatever he thought of women in kitchens, he wasn't going to be rude at his own table, and that mattered to me more than he knew. It was the roast that did it. His mother had made a standing rib roast, and it was, I'll say plainly, very good. Properly rested, a real crust on it. She set it down and he carved, and there was a small automatic pride in the way he did it, muscle memory of a man who'd carved 10,000 things for strangers. Sawyer complimented it, I complimented it, and his father, slicing, said almost to himself, "You can't teach this anymore, the patience for it." And we were off. It started gentle, the way these things do. A comment about how nobody lets a roast rest these days because everyone's rushing the ticket. Then a comment about how culinary schools turn out kids who can plate a microgreen but can't break down a whole animal. Then, warming to it, a comment about how the whole industry confused noise for skill now. The open kitchens, the chefs who became personalities, the places that won awards for plating you couldn't eat. It used to mean something, he said, to run a kitchen. Now they hand the title to whoever's good on camera, Dad, Sawyer said. I'm not lecturing. He gestured with the carving fork, then set it down. I'm giving context. The girl cooks. She should hear how it actually works from somebody who did it for 30 years instead of from a magazine. The girl. I kept my face very still and reached for the bread. It's a hard life, he went on. And now he was talking to me directly, leaning in with the warm, terrible sincerity of a man absolutely certain he is doing you a kindness. I don't say this to discourage you, I say it because somebody should tell you straight. Running a kitchen isn't about flavor. Anybody can learn flavor. It's about who's still standing at 1 in the morning. It's about making the call when 40 covers walk in at 9:45 and your fish guy didn't deliver. It's about carrying the whole room on your back, every night, for years, until your knees go and your marriage gets thin. He took a sip of wine. Most people can't. Most people shouldn't. And the ones who romanticize it the loudest are usually the ones who've never actually had to do it. His mother touched her napkin to her lips and set it down beside her plate, very carefully, the way you set something down when you've decided to brace. There's a kind of judgment, he said, that only comes from time, from having made the call that mattered and lived with it the next morning. You can't shortcut your way to that. There's no class for it. He looked at me with real, almost gentle conviction. The kitchen rewards endurance, not talent, endurance. People who haven't put the years in always think they're ready before they are. I put both hands flat on the edge of the table. I think you're right about most of that, I said. He sat back pleased, the way you're pleased when a student finally gets the lesson. The endurance is real, I said. The fish guy is real. The night your number 2 walks out in the middle of service and you have to expedite and work the protein station at the same time and smile at the dining room like nothing's wrong. That's real. And you're right that nobody can teach it. You just have to survive enough of it. Exactly. He pointed at me, delighted. That's exactly it. That's something I've thought about a lot lately, I said, since I took over. A small pause. He tilted his head. Took over what? I held his eyes. I wasn't loud about it. I've never had to be loud about anything that's actually true. I'm the executive chef at the Hartfield, I said. I started 6 weeks ago. The room didn't make a sound. Not the furnace, not the wind against the storm windows, not the little clock on the sideboard. His mother went completely still with her water glass halfway to the table. Sawyer was staring at his plate with an expression that was equal parts dread and relief. A man watching a wave he'd seen coming finally land. His father's face did several things in quick succession. Confusion first, then a recalculation you could almost watch happen behind his eyes, like a man rewinding a tape. Then, underneath all of it, the very specific look of someone hearing himself played back, sentence by sentence. The Hartfield, he repeated. His voice had lost all of its instruction. It's the only one I know, I said, as kindly as I could. He looked at his son. Sawyer met his eyes for a second and then looked away. You knew, his father said. I wanted you to meet her first, Sawyer said, before all the noise. He absorbed that. Then he looked back at me, and to his credit, he didn't get louder. I'd half expected him to, the way the defensive ones do, doubling down to drown out the embarrassment. Instead, he got very quiet, with the controlled flatness of a man who'd spent decades managing his face in front of full dining rooms, but I could see what was happening underneath it. He was going back through the last 45 minutes, line by line, hearing himself say the girl, hearing himself explain a roast to the person currently running the most demanding Saturday night in the city. How old are you? He asked, not unkindly, more like a man trying to fix a map that had stopped matching the road. 34. He said nothing. But something moved in his shoulders. It wasn't anger. It was the slow arrival of a weight he hadn't been carrying a minute ago. His mother reached over and topped off his water, which was already nearly full, because she needed her hands to be doing something. Well, she said, with the easy composure of a woman who has steered this exact table through 40 years of weather, I think that recolors a good portion of the last hour. He let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. That's a generous way to put it. I thought so, she said. He was quiet a moment longer. Then he looked at me with all the earlier certainty stripped out of it, just a man at his own table now, looking at the person he'd been lecturing like a culinary student. I owe you an apology. You really don't. I spent the better part of an hour, he said, with the grim deliberateness of a man who finishes hard things once he's started them, explaining the restaurant business to the chef running the restaurant I built. I think I do. Sawyer exhaled audibly. His mother looked at her husband with something that might have been pride. You weren't trying to be unkind, I said. You were talking about something you've loved your whole life. That's no excuse for talking down to you. But it explains it. And something shifted in his face again, not embarrassment this time, something closer to curiosity. The look a person gets when they've finished being humiliated and started, almost against their will, being interested. CIA? He asked. Hyde Park. And then? I told him. 2 cities, 2 openings that nearly killed me, a 1-star where I ran the pass for 3 years before this. He listened the way you listen when you actually know what the words cost, nodding at the parts that hurt, not at the parts that sounded good on paper. Who'd you come up under? He asked. I told him. He went still. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. She'd staged in his kitchen once, 20 years ago, before either of us could have known it. She's brutal, he said. She is, I said. She's also the reason I can do this job. She used to make us break down 40 chickens before a shift just to remind us our hands didn't belong to us yet. He almost smiled. That sounds like her. Then he asked the thing I could tell he'd been circling. The hearth room, he said, more carefully now. The old one in the back, the one with the wood oven. Is it still? He stopped. They were talking about pulling it out when I left, said it didn't fit the new concept. It's still there, I said. We rebuilt it last spring. New deck, new flue. It's the heart of the whole menu now. Half the proteins go through it. He set his fork down very slowly. For a second, he didn't say anything at all. I built that oven with a mason from Pilsen, he said finally. 1996. They told me it was a fire hazard. I told them it was the whole point. It still smokes a little when the wind's wrong, I said. We've stopped trying to fix it. The cooks think it's haunted. He laughed then. A real one, surprised out of him. And just like that, the whole shape of the table changed. We talked about the restaurant for the next 20 minutes. Not as a man correcting a girl, but as 2 chefs who happened to know the same building from different decades. He knew things about that kitchen that weren't written down anywhere I'd been able to find. The way the hotline floods if you run both convections in August. The supplier who'd been sneaking him better lamb for years off the books. I knew where the place was going, the things he had no way of knowing, the way the brigade ran now. The woman I'd promoted to Sue's last month who reminded me of myself at 26. We filled in each other's blank spots without either of us deciding to. Sawyer sat back and watched us with the quietly stunned look of a man who'd braced for a car crash and instead walked up on something he didn't have a word for. His mother caught his eye across the table and gave him a small, satisfied look, the look of someone who'd suspected all along that this would land somewhere worth landing. After the table was cleared, Sawyer carried plates to the kitchen, and his mother followed with the serving bowls, and his father and I stayed where we were for a minute. The conversation dropped into a lower register. He turned his wine glass slowly by the stem. "I want to say something," he said. "Okay, what I said earlier, about people getting handed titles, about noise instead of skill." He looked at me directly. I meant it generally, but I aimed it in a direction that wasn't fair, and I knew it wasn't fair while I was doing it, and I kept going anyway. "I know what you meant. That's the part that bothers me. You knew, and you just sat there and let me keep going." "You weren't entirely wrong about the landscape," I said. "Some of what you described is real. There are people who got rooms they didn't earn. There are kitchens that are all camera and no craft. That part's true." I paused. It just wasn't true about me. "And you couldn't have known that because nobody told you." He was quiet for a moment. "How is it really?" "The kitchen, not the press version." So I told him the real version. The vendor who'd quietly tested me for a month before he stopped trying to upsell me garbage. The 2 cooks who'd put in for transfers the week I started, rather than work for a woman, and the one of them who'd come back 6 weeks later and asked, almost angry about it, if the spot was still open. The nights I drove home at 1 in the morning and sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes because I didn't have anything left to give the drive. He listened to all of it without interrupting, nodding at the parts that he recognized from his own 30 years, which turned out to be most of them. "My daughter-in-law shouldn't have to sit through a lecture like that," he said, almost to himself. I noticed the word. Sawyer and I had talked about it, sideways, the way you do when you're both pretty sure but nobody's said it with a ring yet. His father used the word like it was already decided. I don't think he noticed he'd done it. "When I was talking," he said, "all of it. The endurance, the standing at 1 in the morning speech. Be honest with me. Was any of it useful or was it just a waste of your night?" I thought about it for real because he'd asked for real. "The part about carrying the room," I said. "The way you put it, that it's not about flavor, it's about who's still standing. I've felt that for 10 years, but I'd never heard anyone say it that plainly. So no, it wasn't a waste. I'm going to be thinking about that sentence on a bad Saturday for a long time." He looked at me. "You're being generous." "I'm being honest," I said. "I genuinely don't have the time to be generous." He let out that quiet not quite law again. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you do." Sawyer appeared in the doorway, looking between us like a man checking whether the smoke alarm was about to go off. "Everything okay in here?" "We're fine," his father said, and glanced at me. "We're talking." Sawyer retreated to the kitchen with visible relief. His father leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a second, the way people do when they're sorting something out internally before they let it out of their mouth. "I left that restaurant on bad terms," he said. "I know." Sawyer told me, not the details. There weren't many details. There was a lot of money in the room and a lot of people who were very kind to my face. He turned the glass again. I'd had that kitchen for almost 3 decades. They called it a new direction. He was quiet a beat. "I think I've spent 4 years being angrier about that than I ever let myself admit. And I think a lot of that anger has come out of my mouth dressed up as opinions about how everything got worse after I left. I didn't say anything. There wasn't a thing to add to that. It's easier," he said, "to believe the food got worse than to believe the food just kept going. Without me." "It didn't keep going without you," I said. He looked at me. "You built the oven I cook on every single night," I said. "The dining room people drive in from Indiana for is the one you laid out in 1993. The supplier whose relationship you started before I was out of high school. None of that disappeared when you walked out the door. None of that disappeared when you walked out the door. I walked into it. I use it every shift. That's not most of what I have." His jaw moved. He looked down at the table. The chef I came up under used to say something, I went on, when one of us would get full of ourselves about a dish. She said the only real sign a mentor ever built something that'll last is when they can't tell anymore where their work ends and yours begins. He didn't speak for a while. When he did, it was almost under his breath. She sounds like she knows what she's talking about, she does. His mother came to the doorway, drying her hands, and read the room in the half-second it took to look at her husband's face. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," I said. He looked up at his wife. "Yes." And then, quieter, in a voice I don't think was meant for me. "Thank you." She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. In that one exchange, I understood a great deal about how 40 years of marriage actually works. We had coffee in the living room. The talk moved to easier ground, the new building going up next to the restaurant, a chef on the south side they both admired, a long argument about whether you could ever do a proper bouillabaisse this far from an ocean, which we conducted with the seriousness of a Senate hearing and enjoyed enormously. Sawyer sat next to me on the couch and said almost nothing, which I've come to understand is the wisest thing he does. Before we left, his father walked us to the door. He shook Sawyer's hand. Then he turned to me, and I could see him choosing his words more carefully than he had all night. "Come back," he said. "I mean that. I've got 30 years of opinions about that kitchen that nobody's wanted to hear since the day I left." A pause and something almost shy in it. "Some of them might even still be good. I'll hold you to it," I said. He looked faintly surprised, like he'd expected politeness and gotten the real thing instead. Then he nodded, a different nod than the one he'd given me at the door 3 hours earlier. More level, more like one chef to another. His mother hugged me on the porch and held on a second longer than a first meeting calls for. "Come back soon," she said, and then, close to my ear, quiet, "Thank you for being patient with him." I squeezed her hand. I didn't trust myself to say anything. In the car, Sawyer didn't talk for a solid 5 miles. He drove with both hands on the wheel, watching the road like it required all of him. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "You don't need to be. I should have told him a year ago. Maybe. But I think it worked out better this way." He glanced over. "How do you figure?" I watched the dark fields go by, the suburbs thinning back out into nothing, because he didn't get to decide who I was before he met me. He had to take it apart and put it back together right there at the table, in front of his wife, in real time. That's a lot harder than reading a name off a list and forming an opinion. I leaned my head against the cold window. The hard way always holds better. "You weren't actually nervous," he said. "I was a little nervous." "About what?" I thought about it. That he'd be the kind of man who can't survive being wrong. The kind who just gets louder to cover it. I've worked for that man. A lot of him. I paused. But he wasn't that. He was embarrassed, and then he was honest about being embarrassed out loud to my face. That's rarer than people think. Most people would rather burn the whole night down than do that. Sawyer nodded slowly. "He called me the night after the residency thing," he said, and then caught himself, half smiling. "Sorry, old reflex. The night after I first brought you up. He told me you seemed unusually steady for someone still coming up. He couldn't figure out why. What'd you tell him?" I told him, "That's just how she is." Sawyer kept his eyes on the road. Turns out I was right. I looked out at the skyline coming back up over the horizon, that low orange glow, the lake somewhere black beyond it, and the particular quiet that settles in a car when two people have nothing left to prove to each other. 3 weeks after that dinner, my host stand buzzed me at 4 in the afternoon to say there was a call holding for me. A man. Wouldn't leave a name with the host, only that the chef would know him. I picked up between prepping a sauce and walking the line, half distracted. It was Sawyer's father. He got right to it, the way men who ran kitchens for 30 years get right to everything. He had a cook he'd taken under his wing years ago. A good one mid-career now, stuck somewhere downtown under a chef who'd never let him near the menu and was slowly poisoning him on the whole profession. The kid needed to talk to someone who was actually inside it now, who could tell him whether to fight or to leave. Would I take a meeting with him? As a favor. I said yes. We set it for the following Tuesday. After I hung up, I stood at the pass for a second, watching the kitchen do the thing it does at 4 o'clock. The slow build, the radio's crackling, my new Sue calling out her me's, a runner restocking the line, the wood oven already breathing heat into the back of the room. His oven, the one he built with a mason from Pilsen in 1996. The fire popped once, the way it does when the wind's wrong, and nobody flinched, because by now we're all used to it being a little haunted. There's a version of that Sunday that goes loud, where I cut him off the first time he calls me the girl, where I drop my title on the table like a cleaver just to watch the room go quiet just to win. I know that version. I've wanted it. I wanted it constantly when I was 26, every time a supplier asked to speak to the actual chef while I was standing right there in my whites, every time a man explained my own walk-in to me. There is a real and ugly pleasure in the clean kill, and I have felt all of it, but somewhere along the way I learned the difference between the most satisfying thing you can say and the most useful one. They are almost never the same sentence. You can end a conversation, or you can change it. The day after, only one of those ever turns out to have mattered. I didn't want to win that dinner. I wanted a father-in-law. I'm still working on it, and it takes a lot longer than one good Sunday. But that Sunday was the start. And some of the time the start is the only part you really get to control. The rest you just keep showing up for, shift after shift, the way you keep a kitchen running, the way somebody keeps rosemary alive through a Chicago winter, close to the brick, out of the worst of the wind, one cold month at a time, until spring.